Thank you, Auntie Jude, for your wonderful welcome to country. And I'd also like to thank the Bell family for the smoking ceremony that we were able to participate in this morning. You know, this is as intimidating as I expected, and I wish they taught us how to do this in archivist school. So as I said with the housekeeping, my name's Abby Turrell. I am the conference co-convener. The program and conference committees wanted this conference, Here We Are, to be a moment for the archival profession to stop and reflect on where we are. We've had several challenging and tumultuous years, so we invite you over the next couple of days to take a breath and reflect. These are some of the things that we felt we wanted to reflect on. Here we are in our profession. Rather than always looking to the future, where are we situated now, today? How did we end up in the current situation, and what have we achieved? But here we are as archivists. What is our standpoint? Who are we and where do we work? Is this a shared standpoint? But also, who are our allies in the work that we do as well? Where are we in relation to others? What is our relationship to place, to country, to Canberra and the wider community? Here we are, our capacity as practitioners to bring attention to ourselves, to advocate for others, telling people we are here. And also where we aren't, thinking about spaces we might want to move into, areas we do not occupy, conversations we do not currently participate in, and what we can build on, what we can grow to become a stronger profession. We hope this conference and the sessions inspire conversations today, in person and online, but also long after the conference ends. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful time. I would now like to introduce Dr. Sharon Davis.
Caveat, I'm not a doctor, but you're making me think I need to get my act together and do my PhD, so thank you. And I'm just going to keep this because it says doctor as a thing on it, so it makes me feel fancy. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today, the Ngunnawal people, especially Auntie Jude. I recognise and respect their laws and continuing connection to the land, culture and community. I honour the resilience and wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and pay respects to elders past and present. This place always was and always will be unceded Aboriginal land. Naji Gudajin. Another caveat, I'm just getting over a cold. It's not COVID, don't be scared. So just bear with me while I talk, sort of huff and puff my way through the introductions. I am absolutely honoured to be introducing one of the exciting keynote addresses at the Australian Society of Archivists 2022 National Conference. My name is Sharon Davis. I am from both Bardi and Gidja peoples of the Kimberley, and I'm the Director of Education and Ethics at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, or IATSIS. I've had the pleasure of crossing paths a few times with Kirsten in my role at IATSIS. The education team and I work alongside education systems, schools and teachers to not only share the stories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia as told through the IATSIS collection, but also to support teachers to do this confidently. As the education team develop ways to support teacher librarians and classroom teachers to self-audit the appropriateness of Indigenous-related education resources they use in their classrooms and school libraries, I am so grateful to have someone like Dr. Thorpe to reach out to for advice, especially considering her research findings and the important knowledges that you are going to hear today. Currently, Kirsten leads the Indigenous Archives and Data Stewardship Hub at UTS, which advocates for Indigenous rights in archives and data and develops research and engagement in relation to refiguring libraries and archives to support the culturally appropriate ownership, management and ongoing preservation of Indigenous knowledges. Kirsten has broad interest in research and engagement with Indigenous protocols, Indigenous protocols and decolonising practices in the library and archive fields and the broader GLAM sector. Kirsten advocates for the right of reply to records and capacity building and support for the development of living Indigenous archives on country. Her 2021 PhD thesis, Unclasping the White Hand, Reclaiming and Refiguring the Archives to Support Indigenous Wellbeing and Sovereignty, BAM, what a title, that sounds amazing, explores whether the current dominant approaches to archiving and managing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges support the wellbeing of Indigenous people and recognise Indigenous sovereignty in an archival context. The research investigates the broad historical and political context of the contested nature of the archives for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia and the level of agency that Indigenous people have to control and own their archives. Framed in an Indigenous research paradigm, the research draws on Indigenous standpoint theory, records continuum theory, Indigenous story work and yarning methodologies with a critical theory framework to consider Indigenous people's engagement with the archives. Additionally, Kirsten has extensive experience working in major collecting institutions across public libraries and archives to support Indigenous engagement and priorities. Kirsten was previously the Manager, Indigenous Services at the State Library of New South Wales, where she led the development of strategies supporting statewide information services for Indigenous people. This included support for Indigenous priorities and cultural competency across New South Wales public libraries, the launch of the library's first Indigenous collecting strategies, and projects that supported the documentation, return and revitalisation of Indigenous Australian languages through archival sources. Kirsten is an invited member of the International Council of Archives expert group on Indigenous matters and a co-founder of the Indigenous Archives Collective. Most recently, she was named the recipient of the 2023 UTS Chancellor's Postdoc Indigenous Fellowship. Her project will examine Indigenous data sovereignty in an archival context and be supervised by distinguished Professor Larissa Brent. In this morning's keynote, Kirsten will take Henrietta Fourmile's seminal article, Who Owns the Past? Aborigines, as Captives of Archives, as a starting point. Since its publication in 1989, there has been significant awareness of the importance of the archives to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. However, the question still remains, are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people still captives of the archives? In her keynote, Kirsten will reflect on the calls to action asserted by Henrietta Fourmile to consider the current support for Indigenous people's self-determination and recognition of sovereignty in the archives in Australia. I'm very excited. It is also an honour to have Simon Frood, Director General of the Australian Archives of Australia, with us to provide a discussion of Kirsten's keynote. Simon recently joined the National Archives in May 2022, and prior to this was Director and State Archivist at State Records of South Australia, where he was responsible for the preservation and accessibility of some of the state's most important historical records. During his time at the State Archives, Simon advised on records and information management, freedom of information and privacy for the South Australian Government. I have to do a mum thing for a second, just wipe my nose, get a tissue out of my sleeve, so excuse me. Well, at least it wasn't out of my bra, so. Sorry. As Director General of National Archives of Australia, Simon is leading the agency through the next phase of its transformation to ensure it remains a beacon for best practice management of the official records of the Commonwealth of Australia, and that Australian Government information of enduring significance is secured, preserved and available to government agencies, researchers and the community. Simon's driving passion is to improve the accessibility of government records with a particular focus on improving access to individuals and groups impacted by past government policy. An important achievement by Simon, State Records and in partnership with the South Australian State Library, was the establishment of the first South Australian Aboriginal Reference Group, established to develop responses to the International Council on Archives Tandanya Adelaide Declaration and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Library, Information and Resource Network Protocols. Simon acknowledges that his role as Director General of National Archives comes with great responsibility, a responsibility to do the right thing by all Australian citizens through improved access, understanding and awareness of this collection. So just before I invite Kirsten up to start, I want you to have a bit of a think. We want it to be a bit of an interactive session, so as the keynotes are up having a yarn, think about some questions that you can ask in the Q&A afterwards. That'd be fantastic. So I'm very much looking forward to this keynote and response, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Kirsten Thorpe and Simon Frood.
Thanks so much, Sharon. I just had a bit of a panic that we didn't have the slides, so we're off to a good start. Thanks so much, Sharon, for the introduction, and thanks for the ASA for the invitation to present today. It's a real privilege and an honour for me to be here with my peers, my friends and my colleagues to share this time with you this morning to discuss this question of whether Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to be captives of the archives. And apparently I'm saying next slide as we go. So I acknowledge that I'm on Ngunnawal land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge their care and nurturing of the land for thousands of years. Thanks to Aunty Jude for the welcome and for Sharon for the introductions and also for the smoking ceremony this morning. And thanks, Simon, for joining the conversation after the presentation. I also want to acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today and also other people online. I know for many people within the ASA, I've known people here for a long time, but for others this might be an opportunity to first get to know you. So I wanted to introduce myself briefly before I get into the presentation. And I think no, not next slide. I'm going to get in the hang of this without touching it. So my family are Worimi people. I'm a mother's side from Port Stephens, New South Wales. I'm a mother, I'm a sister, an aunt, a cousin and a daughter and a partner. I'm the daughter of Robin Thorpe, who would have been very proud to hear that intro. I'm the granddaughter of Rose Bergman, who was a Newlyn, great-granddaughter of Violet Feeney, and the great-granddaughter of Florence Mountain. And I guess I wanted to acknowledge to start out that within the presentation that much of my drive to contribute is based on my family's experiences, and in particular I reflect on the legacy of my grandmother Rose Bergman, who I wish I had a chance to meet. So next slide. So I've got a lot to cover today, and I'm going to spend some time sharing with you the key findings of my doctoral research, which, as Sharon mentioned, focuses on the contested nature of the archives for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the impact of this on Indigenous people, its wellbeing and sovereignty, and then I'm going to turn very briefly to explore some new models to support archival sovereignty that are informed by Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing in the archives. At the outset, it's important for me to explain that my experiences of employment and professional practice provide a significant backdrop to my doctoral studies and my standpoint in the research. Although my entry into the archives and information field was pretty much accidental and inspired by an interest in history and social justice, I found my life work situated in contributing dialogue and engagement on the intersections between Indigenous knowledge and worldviews and archival studies. Prior to engaging in the doctoral studies, I'd worked in the field for over 2 decades, building policy, protocols, practice, and spaces for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have agency in libraries and archives. I have highly conflicting emotions about libraries, archives and collecting institutions. I don't consider them to be, in their current form, to be sacred and safe spaces. I see them as both places to love and loathe. I have directly witnessed these institutions' role in supporting evidence and accountability and the identity needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. However, I've also experienced how they can be places of violence and erasure. So my standpoint situates how I know and understand the world and my knowledge through these professional and lived experiences and interactions. And it's important that I acknowledge this because I also need to acknowledge the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's experience with the archives at the outset. In particular, I want to point out the absolute critical nature of the archives for Indigenous people and also acknowledge deeply the journey of stolen generation survivors who are still trying to find information in archives. So I want to start by, next slide, returning to the words of Henrietta Fourmile. The seminal article by Henrietta Fourmile grounds the issues concerning the care and management of Indigenous knowledges broadly in the archives. In the article, Who Owns the Past? Aborigines as Captives of the Archives, published in 1989, Fourmile critiques the archives, outlining the broad historical and political context of their contested nature for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Fundamentally, Fourmile explores the tensions of Indigenous archives being held in white hands and discusses the issues and concerns that emerge from the lack of Indigenous control of the archives. Fourmile's calls to action demonstrate the long-standing and wicked problems associated with the archives in Australia. Today, I want to share the findings of my doctoral research, or some of them, and explore the question of whether Aboriginal people remain captives of the archives. But before I turn to the research, I want to briefly outline what Fourmile expressed as being major concerns in the 1989 paper. So next slide, thanks. So Fourmile questions the level of agency that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to control their own archives. Dislocation, disconnection and dispersal are all concepts that Fourmile targets as concerns. These issues relate to a deep sense of loss of control over the distribution, access and management of cultural heritage material in order for Indigenous people to tell their own stories. Fourmile's article provides the context to understand Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's demands for better access, governance and control of the archives in Australia. Fourmile foregrounds the importance of archives not being thought as relics of the past, but as vital tools for justice seeking in the present, and argues that significant tensions exist when Aboriginal records are held in non-Aboriginal hands. Foremost of these concerns are issues of ownership and privileged access to the archive, and this privilege extends from what Fourmile argues is a serious barrier to Aboriginal people in the making of our own history. The lack of dialogue and joint stewardship of the archives is apparent in the claims for greater justice and the ability for the archives to enable a shared enterprise for the care of Indigenous cultural material. Additionally, Fourmile describes the sense of isolation that Indigenous people experience when wanting to access materials in the archives, arguing that, and quote, Aboriginal people feel ill at ease and self-conscious when entering white institutions which emanate an entirely alien presence. These tensions and the deliberate neglect to prioritise the care of Indigenous archives results in a high level of distrust of collecting institutions. In addition, Fourmile critiques whether Indigenous people are currently aware of what archives relating to their families and themselves exist. She further raises concerns about who has the right to interrogate the archives, who has the right to tell these stories. Are these stories always told through the lens of non-Indigenous people? The link between archival access, control and management are considered alongside questions of power, agency and representation. Fourmile draws out in an incredibly short article many issues related to the tensions and distress experienced by Indigenous people when they cannot care for their ancestors' stories with dignity and respect. The needs are framed in the context of understanding rights for self-determination over the archives and the importance of governance and decision-making powers being in the hands of Indigenous people. Fourmile also raises the topic of the sector's broad need to engage in difficult dialogue. She reflects on the series of presentations delivered as part of the History Forum, where the seminal paper first appeared. Fourmile's comments on the protection of Indigenous intellectual property and the need to protect information that relates to secret and sacred materials is discussed. As well as providing this critique, Fourmile asserts the importance of Indigenous people being able to design futures for archives to be established locally on country. The view is strongly asserted that local keeping places should be developed to support cultural revitalisation, healing and maintenance. On top of these demands for greater control and transformation of the archives, Fourmile provided comment on the need to balance the use of archives for cultural revitalisation alongside the need for truth-telling around the histories of colonisation and dispossession, noting the liberation of Aboriginal people can only take place with the help of the educated, understanding that the non-Aboriginal community must confront fundamental truths about its own character. Anglo-Australians, Fourmile said, must realise that they have no mortgage on civilised behaviour. Lastly, Fourmile article discusses the tensions that arise with the collision of Western and Indigenous worldviews within a broader context of a lack of policy that essentially prevents Indigenous self-determination being exercised. In the next slide, thanks. So Fourmile says this lack of cultural policy has disastrous consequences for Aboriginal people. What we experience is the effective withholding of our cultural and historical resources from us. We see this as part of a deliberate strategy of assimilation, the real agenda behind the official policy rhetoric of self-determination. If the revitalisation and resurgence of Aboriginal culture is to fully take place, and so that we can contribute to our culture to the world heritage on our own terms, then we must again be able to own, control and enjoy our cultural and historical resources housed within our own community facilities. So taking a journey through the words of Fourmile reveals the extent of the systemic issues in the archives. The calls for action for more significant control of the archives for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are heard loud and clear. Acknowledging the conference theme, here we are. My question is, after 3 decades, are Aboriginal people still captives of the archives in the way described by Fourmile? And are the archives still firmly clasped in white hands? So next slide. So now to turn to my doctoral research. Sharon's given a bit of introduction, but I wanted to note that I used Fourmile's seminal articles within the research to investigate in part how we could unclasp the white hand, and thanks to Dr. Alex Byrne for all of the inspiration with the title. So as Sharon mentioned, the research explored whether the current dominant approaches to archiving and managing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges support the wellbeing of Indigenous people and recognise Indigenous sovereignty in an archival context. It investigated the contested nature of the archives and the level of agency that Indigenous people had in relation to controlling their own cultural heritage materials. The research, in summary, identified immediate reforms required to support Indigenous people's archiving needs and outlined a transformative model of Indigenous living archives on country to support Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing in the archives, and importantly, to enable redress from the impacts of colonisation. And before I go further into the research, I also want to thank deeply the participants of the research for their enormous contributions. Some of you are here and others online, and I really want to sincerely thank you for trusting me with your words, your knowledge and experiences. And I also want to acknowledge Emerita Professor Sue McCamish, Dr. Alex Byrne, and Dr. Shannon Forkhead for being what could only be described as an incredible supervisory team for the PhD. A lot of people sort of, when it's over, really glad I am, but I also miss our incredible conversation. So I thank them for making it such a rewarding experience. So next slide. So the 3 main questions that I explored in the PhD, which are relevant to the talk today, are how well is Indigenous wellbeing and sovereignty conceptualised in an archival context? How do archives impact on Indigenous people's wellbeing and sovereignty? And thirdly, how would a transformative model that supports Indigenous wellbeing and archival sovereignty be developed? In essence, the research sought to build a deeper understanding of the holistic needs of Indigenous people in the archives, and included in this are questions of what spiritual and emotional needs should be considered in archival approaches and methods. So next slide. My research approach is worth noting briefly as well. The research was deeply embedded in Indigenous research methodologies and principles of relational research. Ethical practice was also important, aligned with the IATSIS Research Code and other ethical frameworks for Indigenous research. Being at Monash within the IT faculty, the research had a deep systems focus within archival studies broadly and drew deeply on the concepts of the archival multiverse and the records continuum. I used autoethnography as one key method, and as an insider researcher, I wrote extensively about my experiences and reflections of professional practice. And this data was then analysed and turned into case studies as a chapter in the thesis. I engaged in yarning methods to build partnership research with 4 different cohort groups, and reciprocal relationships and ongoing dialogue were present throughout all of the research phases, and feedback was incredibly critical. The research to me was about uncovering data and stories that were always on the margins. I often say they were things that were talked about in the conference hallways rather than in the sessions. Attribution of people's knowledge was negotiated through ethics, and consent was given for people's words to be shared beyond the broader analysis of the themes. It was definitely circular and reflexive research. There were many stories shared, and reflecting on my own experiences in the archives was both painful and rewarding. Archibald's storywork principles enabled me to intertwine the stories with the narratives of others in the research, and it was my overall sense-making tool. I analysed Archibald's 7 storywork principles that were respect, reverence, responsibility, reciprocity, holism, interrelatedness, and synergy to ground the research and its outputs. So let's turn to some of the major findings. I'll go to the next slide. So when I started the PhD research, I initially drew on William's concept of cultural safety as a foundational concept to explore how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can feel unsafe when engaging broadly with libraries and archives in Australia. I see the term being used as a bit of a buzzword or catchphrase when people describe engagement. And I wanted to investigate how libraries and archives could negatively impact Indigenous people's well-being by failing to produce information and archiving systems that best meet Aboriginal people's cultural and community needs. What I found as an outcome of the research is that the term cultural safety in an archival context lacked attention to the systemic and structural issues, and it oversimplifies the complex and multifaceted needs that require critique about how the archives have been tools of colonisation and how these are manifested in the archive and institutions of Australian society today. Next slide. So I came to think more deeply about the archives as a tool in the Australian colonial project. Indigenous scholar Irene Watson describes the colonial project as being embodied a centuries-long ongoing campaign to annihilate, define, subordinate and exclude, in inverted commas, the native, and an arsenal of tools has been applied to these ends. I was interested in what features of the colonial archive model continue to exist without being adequately addressed. How do we unknowingly, or sometimes knowingly, perpetuate the use of record keeping as part of these arsenal of tools in the archives? Next slide. Another step that I took in the PhD was to refocus from terms like cultural safety to instead consider Indigenous people's social, cultural and emotional well-being in the archives. The term social and emotional well-being is used by many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to describe the social, emotional, spiritual and, importantly, cultural well-being of a person. The term recognises their connection to land, sea, culture, spirituality, family and community, which are important to people and impact on their well-being. It also recognises that a person's social, emotional well-being is influenced by policies and past events. The research showed how the concept of cultural safety lacked clarity. Cultural safety for who? Was it cultural competence? Was it cultural awareness? And instead focus on concepts of well-being. To me, well-being represents a position of greater agency. Next slide. So ultimately, this led me to undertaking an in-depth analysis of the harmful impacts on Indigenous well-being and sovereignty of the colonial model of archival approaches. So what I'd like to do now is go through 6 main areas identified as harms and dangers in the context of how they relate to Indigenous wellbeing and sovereignty in the archives. Next slide. There's a lot of detail in this, so I hope you're thinking of the questions. So the first of the 6 points that were the immediate harms is that Indigenous knowledges are managed inappropriately in Western knowledge systems. An Indigenous view of wellbeing and sovereignty in the archives requires further focus on the spiritual and emotional facets of care that are needed to align with Indigenous worldviews. There is currently a lack of respect for how Indigenous people wish to manage records relating to their cultures, histories and ancestors. Mainstream approaches to providing access to Indigenous cultural material, both physically and digitally, support Western knowledge management frameworks, which threaten Indigenous people's cultural norms and protocols. As government institutions, the archives maintain the structures and forms of the dominant culture, which are based on Western rather than Indigenous values. There is currently a significant gap in how the archives engage with different ways of knowing, and this gap produces actual harm in not providing Indigenous people with the dignity and respect for their cultural values and belief. The research showed insufficient awareness of the silencing and subjugating of Indigenous worldviews in the archives, both in terms of the limited existence of Indigenous created records and the contextual information or metadata related to archives and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In other words, it's not just about the content of the records or the items, collections or objects that exist, but also being aware of the silences in the descriptive metadata that documents the archives. The current metadata gaps, for example, extend from the nature and background of the records, metadata about appropriate access and use arrangements, to metadata required for the attribution of knowledge. A critical gap exists in understanding how much of this documentation has been created with the active participation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. These are structural issues related to both classification and description and the interplay with current standards and normative practices in the archives. The research raised issues concerning the ethics of care required to manage the archive with appropriate emotional and spiritual considerations. With gaps in official policy in this regard, participants discussed the need for new ways to build practices that provided dignity for people's ancestors and care for staff working with them. The words of Tasha James shared in the yarning sessions demonstrate the connectedness of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to the spiritual care in the archives. And Tasha says, I know that working at a major collecting institution, the first time I was there, the first week, the energy of that place was just too much. I remember going home saying, I'm exhausted. I hear a lot of noise, but I just don't know what it is. I don't know what's going on there. Then it was another Indigenous woman who was working there as a contractor. When I first met her, she said to me, oh, things are heavy, aren't they? Then I was just like, yes, how did you know that? And she's like, I see it and I feel it. She gave me some tips on how to deal with that, because these are things that only blackfellas can feel and tell each other. Again, it's not something that the organisation recognises or are attuned to. They would just throw you in there because to them you're in this position, like you're in this role. We want you to do this. So they're not aware of all these other kinds of things that come from a cultural perspective. I remember taking that advice and her saying that you just have to acknowledge it and take care of yourself, and it's the energies of the place. It's like when you're attuned to that it becomes overwhelming. So one of the tools used to engage in dialogue in the sector has been articulating protocols to assist libraries, archives and information services in maintaining archives with respect to Indigenous people's needs. The influential ASA2022 protocols, first developed in 1995 and reviewed in 2005, are intended to guide archives in appropriate ways to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their interests in managing and handling materials appropriately. However, the protocols are situated in the context of institutional archives and within the profession. Although they aim to recognise that Indigenous people are the rightful owners of their cultural heritage and knowledge, they nevertheless privilege the needs of the institutions. This privileging has much to do with how institutional archives act to prioritise or hinder progress with areas such as improving documentation, addressing needs around access or digitisation of the archives, or enabling other enhancements to the records through a right of reply. Recent literature that focuses on archives and affect has discussed important questions about the emotional affect of the archives. The archives have real potential to cause emotional impact on people engaging with them, including feelings of trauma and horror. Due to this, there is stress caused by records not being cared for properly, and it is disrespectful and degrading to Indigenous people when their cultural values are silenced and subjugated. In addition, the archives are challenged to manage cultural materials according to ongoing cultural flows and fluid decisions regarding what should be open or what should be closed, and to whom. Keeping cultures alive requires access to and use of the archives through ongoing relationships. There are gaps currently in how the community can maintain power and control over the stories that are held in archives. This makes the archive static and fixed in a way that doesn't align with Indigenous cultural flows of information through stories, dance and art. And it also limits the ability for communities to speak back to the archives, to change them and update their context and understanding. The community loses the power to maintain the relationships with the stories held in the archives as the relationships are severed. And although there's been movement by researchers and particularly creative practitioners, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, engaging with the archive, most of the results of their research or creative outputs sit outside the archives, and they are not linked back to the descriptive materials documenting the archives. The research showed that more rigorous interventions are required to build dynamic links between these materials to keep flows of information linked to and from the archives. Next slide. I think that was the big one. So the second identified harmful impact relates to the recognition of the role of the archives in the Australian colonial project. When discussing wellbeing and sovereignty issues in the archives, attention arose that the archives, broadly across institutions, the professions and within theory and education, has not explicitly come to terms with their role in supporting the Australian colonial project. If we return to the arsenal of tools, we can see the link between the role of record keeping, colonial collecting and documentation that helps support the surveillance, control and regulation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The research has been interested in the features and forms of the broad systems and structures of the archives across areas including appraisal, acquisition, arrangement and description, as well as use of the archives. The research has further confirmed the pervasiveness of the archives holding surveillance records and that collections are predominantly created about Indigenous people rather than by Indigenous people. In this way, the archives enable systemic colonial marginalisation in how the knowledge structures perpetuate Western worldviews within the structures of their classification, cataloguing and descriptions. In the research, it was shown that these are not only historical issues, but the structures and systems of record keeping and archiving remain. The harm caused by this lack of Indigenous stewardship and control of archiving is a current challenge. In the yarning sessions, Annie Glendra-Stubbs discussed the issues raised in the recent Families Culture Review report in 2019 by Megan Davis, noting she was scathing about the collection of data. The report, she said, identified an urgent need for data, as the reporting of harms and abuse of children in out-of-home care was unclear in the data and the files relating to children. These examples of documentation of contemporary removals of Aboriginal children from their families demonstrate the lack of agency that Indigenous people continue to experience with the perpetuation of colonial harms within data collection and record-keeping practices. Another topic arising in the research related to colonisation and dispossession in Australia and the gaps of truth-telling in the profession. A recurring theme in the yarning session has been the lack of education and awareness that the wider Australian public and the profession has on Aboriginal history. Linked directly to this are gaps in awareness of the impacts of the colonial project on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities today. The words of Marika Juchinski speak to issues of white fragility and a lack of recognition of the archives in the colonial project. And Marika says, so it's really problematic when we choose to dumb down the reality of our brutal history of this nation because we don't want to offend people, because we don't want to compromise people's white fragility. A lot of non-Aboriginal people live in a closeted environment in which they are never confronted with any kind of racial stress. And so when they are confronted with it, suddenly the world collapses. How dare you? Things like, that's not okay, I wasn't the one who did that to you. Colonial institutions, Marika says particularly, often choose only to celebrate or show one narrative and not incorporate Aboriginal perspective. It's lazy and it's offensive, and we should be having constructive conversations. Next slide. The next harm identified, the third key harm, was a lack of Indigenous self-determination in the archives and a failure to adopt Indigenous-led approaches in archival practices. This lack of Indigenous self-determination was described in the research through a commonly expressed observation that at any time the government... Sorry, I've lost my place. That at any time the government and the archives could change their minds and shut things down to protect themselves. Essentially, this regulation and potential for information to be controlled without Indigenous participation indicated a limited ability in the archives for Indigenous governance and control. Indeed, there was also scepticism shown that self-determination was not a reality. It was difficult for people to imagine a real commitment by the archives and other government institutions to engage in negotiated terms with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Without a treaty, there was no core need for the archives to act, except responding to moral imperatives. And Alison Whittaker says, I have to say from my subjective experience, it doesn't feel like what I'm doing is self-determination when we approach the archives. It feels like harm minimisation, and I'm wary. I think that it just may be the standpoint that I bring to it, but I'm wary of treating my interactions with state institutions predominantly as self-determining acts. Alison says, I appreciate there's a self-determining strategy behind it, but I don't think in that sense I'm asserting anything. I think that sense of spaces being open to us now, but they can be closed off at any time. That sense of strategic temporality, I think, is really there. So although the archives are beginning to respond to Indigenous people's needs, the work was described as being reactive and that it lacks critical engagement with representatives, families and communities. Next slide. So the archives' inability to engage with Indigenous people's sovereignty. A focus on Indigenous sovereignty supports a broader recognition of Indigenous people's diversity and speaks back to the notion of pan-Indigenous and homogenous views of Indigenous people across Australia. Importantly, the views of sovereignty and archival sovereignty represented a spiritual and embodied connection to country and ancestors. The acknowledgement of Indigenous sovereignty grounds support for recognising local community needs and multiple views in the archives. Essentially, this means not having a blanket approach for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but recognising local communities' unique cultures, histories and experiences. The research identified a vital need for decision-making processes to be put in place to support Indigenous people and sovereignty in the archives. The research examined the strong links between decision-making and well-being and the elements of people needing agency, authority, voice and autonomy. Encompassing all of this was a connection to country and community. And it also showed that these attributes of sovereignty in the archives were linked to Indigenous people having stewardship over the archives. And Nathan Sentence said, it's hard to want self-determination in a system that is so westernised. I think that's a problem. Archives and libraries are naturally Western. They were not designed with First Nation sovereignty and First Nation people's First Nation self-determination in mind. They're things we're trying to incorporate now. That is why it can be difficult for it to happen now, and hopefully it will happen in the future. But it will be a slow process. There are ways we can do it in small doses that are effective and are good, but at the same time, I think it also requires mass disruption that organisations might not be ready for. Another concept related to this assertion of Indigenous archival sovereignty shared in the research related to the concepts of time. There are gaps in how the archives work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people concerning time, and how institutions push against cultural timelines with institutional schedules. The research showed that there were tensions around how expectations were managed with regard to time schedules. There was also a lack of regard for Indigenous people's needs to go out and speak with communities about the archives, and in some cases, the urgency to push institutional goals moving ahead caused incredible tensions. Examples of this arose when people were talking about development of exhibitions and other areas such as the desire for archives and institutions to be incorporating Indigenous naming and language. I know there's been a lot of hard truths that I've been talking about, but there was also a huge amount of optimism that was expressed in the research about the archives and more broadly the GLAM sector being at the cusp of change. But there was a word of warning that despite this growing commitment, there was an awareness that the bursts of momentum and support for Indigenous priorities were frequently led by individuals. Therefore, if the leadership's committed to Indigenous engagement, the archives see growth and development. But if the leadership changes, so do the priorities. Therefore, leadership support for Indigenous priorities in the archive is a vital ingredient for Indigenous sovereignty to be supported. However, the research showed a lack of maturity in the archive sector to support Indigenous people's priorities through appropriate strategy, policy and resourcing. Currently, the sector is in its infancy with the support for the transformations that are needed. In 2019, the International Council of Archives released the Tandanya Adelaide Declaration, which is being promoted by many as a source for change. And included within its 5 key themes for immediate action, there's one priority area specifically focused on self-determination. However, as discussed in a recent article by Rose Barracliff, Lauren Brooker, Sue McCamish and I, there are real tensions around strategic approaches being focused on institutional archives and their needs. A lack of formal agreements made regarding Indigenous-led stewardship of the archives means that projects are often reactive and projects are progressed through band-aid approaches. Next slide. So the 5th in-depth harm identified relates to the existence of the white blindfold and systemic bias and racism in the archives. Within the research, it became clear that Indigenous GLAM participants experienced a sense of erasure working in government hierarchies and power structures, with multiple people sharing views that efforts were token and they were often band-aid solutions for complex problems. An area of dialogue seen as urgently needing attention related to dominance of whiteness in the profession. The tensions of non-Indigenous people needing more cultural awareness or cultural competence highlighted the call for more understanding of Indigenous priorities. The level of knowing and understanding of people's own cultural positions, including how people had benefited from colonisation through the Australian Colonial Project, is critical. The dominance of whiteness in the profession was not solely about the demographic makeup, but also about attitudes and practices, including issues of the white blindfold. The research found that the archives supported dominant culture and lacked insight on whiteness. Further, it found that the archives perpetuated negative stereotypes and continued to circulate harmful materials, including offensive and racist records. The research demonstrated that predominantly the archives' priorities and resources were directed toward institutional needs. Related to this were also consideration about the types of roles that Indigenous employees held and how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people often lacked agency and ability to make decisions in lower level positions. And Rebecca Bateman says, only because traditionally, Indigenous people are not always at levels where they can actually do much. That's the only reason I'm saying you see a lot of, in my experience, it's not Indigenous people who are in a position where they can go and actually make a difference, and they get it. And you've got a bit of drive and you sort of make the most of it. So an overwhelming feeling was that change is difficult in the archives, and the work of Indigenous people in this space leads to significant burnout. The research showed that archives are often slow to act and change, and the current workforce does not have the ability to engage deeply in work that is anti-racist and transformative. In other words, the current focus is on supporting white privilege and whiteness rather than Indigenous wellbeing and sovereignty. So the final, next slide, the final harms, and these are hard to hear, they're hard to read. The final harmful impact was around the notion of cultural load and Indigenous employment in the archives. So a pervasive issue identified in the research was the challenge that Indigenous workers face in representing all things Indigenous in the archives, and that Indigenous staff were becoming a dumping ground for Indigenous priorities and projects. Overall, the gap in numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people employed in the archives and more broadly in GLAM has a significant impact on Indigenous staff. Besides cultural competency, increasing roles for Indigenous workers and especially roles on country was a major focus that required attention. And Charlotte Moore said, I think the gaps in having people working with archives and libraries who are culturally capable and competent. I mean, I use that as cultural competence is another sort of measure of how people do their work. I mean, that's the way I look at it. It's just as important as having great communication skills, interpersonal skills, writing skills. I think being culturally competent is up there with all of those other expectations of working in this space. So in addition, there was concern expressed that there were currently gaps in retaining and securing staff with salaries that are commensurable to the project and the tasks required. In terms of the future of archives, the research uncovered a significant issue of low numbers of Indigenous people employed and gaps in terms of understanding the types of employment and competencies required in the archives. A large focus of the research was around dismantling the status quo in the archives, and part of this related to a clearly expressed need for more local community archives to be developed on country. Also, Indigenous workers expressed real need for the time to debrief and take care of their own emotional and spiritual health, particularly in cases where staff are required to navigate community interests and rights across institutional archival contexts. Participants discussed the importance of the archives being proactive about prioritising community interests over the interests of institutions. So, a deep breath. Here we are, and so where to next? As I said, I know that's a lot to take in, and again, thanks to the participants of the research for the most incredible insights. And I hope you all feel both overwhelmed and privileged of hearing the truths that were laid bare by people contributing. But I'm going to finish up by sharing some immediate steps for archival reforms and some potential models for transformation. I could have spent a lot of time focusing on the next steps, but I think it's important that we get ourselves uncomfortable. We have to talk about the harmful impacts of the colonial model of archiving that I've just outlined, and I don't think we can skip to the next steps without really settling down into that dialogue. I would argue that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are still captives of the archives without dismantling these systems. It's going to be a long journey, it's going to require further research and dialogue, but I think the recognition of the colonial harms that are embedded in our archival practice needs attention. So to briefly outline some models. So next slide. So my research produced a model of Indigenous wellbeing and sovereignty in the archives with 4 themes identified around reclamation, truth-telling, restoration and representation. And one of the things that's really important about looking at this model is that it identifies some of the foundational work that has already been done. There is some groundwork there, and it's vital that I think as a profession we start to look back at where we've come from in order to discuss these transformation and futures. Next slide. Having outlined what I imagine you're all feeling are some major systemic issues of the harms of the archives for Indigenous people, we can see how they conceptually come together to bring a view of how the archives can be reformed to support Indigenous people's wellbeing and sovereignty. So my research identified a number of key reforms in the archives. The first is Indigenous protocols, and by that I mean not institutional protocols to support Indigenous wellbeing, sovereignty and archival sovereignty. The next was recognising the archives as a place of sorry business. There's deep sorrow for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people engaging with these places. The next was the importance of Indigenous stewardship and custodian of materials held in the archives, and by that it means beyond access. It means building in the care and protection that's needed to manage material in the right way. And aligned with that is the next point around Indigenous cultural practices and ceremonies being a part of archival practice. The second and last point is around returning love to ancestors and noting the work of Dr. Natalie Harkin, looking at the process that we give dignity to people who are both with us and people who have passed on. And finally, as Sharon mentioned, the subject of my postdoc research is looking at how the Indigenous data sovereignty area can help inform the archives. So 2 more quick things for me. I'll go to the next slide. You know, at the core of the research was this transformation that is needed to support the health of country, the health of people, and the view for Indigenous sovereignty in an archival context. So looking at what Indigenous Living Archive on country would look like. And it was really outside of the scope of the studies to look at all the detailed requirements and how to enact them. And I think these are real areas for priority research. There was real strong recognition in the doctoral studies that we have to develop best practice models, roadmaps and strategies in order to enact this change. But at the core of that, we need to focus on the support for Indigenous governance and management of the archives. Next slide. So I want to end and have a breath by sharing a working definition that came together as part of the research, which is a conceptualisation of Indigenous wellbeing, sovereignty and archival sovereignty. When we started, someone said I was going to talk about decolonisation, and I know that I haven't used the word once in my presentation, but I want to finish with these words because I think this is about more than decolonisation. You know, as a working definition, this needs to go back to communities, it needs people to pull it apart, but I'll finish with this definition as, you know, a potential aspiration for the profession. So a conceptualisation of Indigenous wellbeing, sovereignty and archival sovereignty would mean Indigenous wellbeing in the archives is formed by embedding respect for Indigenous worldviews and lifeways to support individual and community social, emotional and cultural needs. The archives are grounded in acknowledging Indigenous people's agency and sovereignty and recognise their rights to have authority over managing materials that relate to them through locally informed protocols. These protocols enable governance and decision-making of the archives, incorporating ethical, spiritual and emotional care of Indigenous knowledges relating to country and people both living and their ancestors. Indigenous sovereignty in the archives recognises and gives visibility to the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It is free from racism and proactively seeks to address the legacies of colonisation. The archives function to reform its position as from being perpetrators of harm, to enable Indigenous people to exercise their self-determination, to reclaim, to restore the archives and speak back to them and amplify their contexts and meanings. As a place of healing and truth-telling, the archives require difficult dialogue and contestation. And finally, Indigenous archival sovereignty is centred in relationships. It is a living Indigenous archive connected to people and place. It is constantly being used and reshaped through cultural flows and connections. It is deeply connected to country and embedded in stories of place. It is a space of cultural resurgence and centres Indigenous people's wellbeing holistically to support individual, community, social, emotional and cultural needs. So a lot to take in. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope that the hard truths aligned with the aspirations give us all something to think about in the conference. Yeah, thanks for being a part of it, and I'm going to hand over to Sharon and Simon.
How to follow that. Yuma, welcome and thank you and hello to everybody. I'd just like to begin by thanking the ASA for putting on the conference this year. Great lineup, great speakers, and looking forward to the next few days. I'd also like to thank Bradley for the smoking ceremony this morning, Auntie Jude for the wonderful welcome to country, and obviously to Sharon and to Kirsten. I'd just like to begin with an acknowledgement to country, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today, the Ngunnawal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And also acknowledge the owners of the lands where all of our virtual attendees are on today, and just pay my respects to all First Nations people who are in the audience today. I'd like to acknowledge Kirsten and the work that she has done. I think I've had the pleasure of reading her thesis, and for anybody who gets an opportunity to read it, I would suggest that you do so. I think it's groundbreaking work, and really, listening to Kirsten, it's an opportunity for us all to, I guess, have our eyes opened, and at the same time, I think, have the profession pulled in the right direction. We need people like Kirsten to really think about the areas of the profession where we need to improve, and the acknowledgement and respect that we need to pay to our First Nations communities who we work with, and our customers, our First Nations staff, and the records that we hold within our collections. As Kirsten mentioned, the conversations that are generated through the work that she's done, and the other conversations that are going on around the nation and around the world at the moment, can be very uncomfortable, particularly for white people. They force us collectively to reconsider who we are, what we want to be, and our role as archivists, and that's a good thing. We should be uncomfortable because we've had a pretty terrible past. I'd also like to just acknowledge something that Kirsten mentioned right at the very beginning of her presentation, and that was around the importance of family and what she's learned through her family and how that's guided her in the work that she has done. And I think we, as archivists and as professionals, when we are looking at our work on a day-to-day basis, I think we need to remember that the records that we hold in our collections are not just boxes on shelves. The individual papers in those files and in those registers, and the photographs are all connections for people, either to family, to community, to nation, to culture and to language. And it's important that we have that in the back of our minds all the time, because it's very easy to forget the importance and the value that we ourselves and others should place on those records. When I was first approached by Nicola to be part of this keynote speech, to say that I was uncomfortable about accepting is probably an understatement. it's a great opportunity, and being on the stage with Kirsten is a real privilege. But at the same time, there's a significant level of uncomfortableness on my part being up here. Firstly, because I didn't want to be up here to be seen to be blindly defending either the archival sector generally or white people or anything like that. And also, I have obviously need to recognise that, you know, I'm a middle-aged white guy. You know, despite my best efforts, that middle age has crept up on me. You know, I'm also English by birth, and therefore have an uncomfortable position with colonialism. I'm also a career public servant, having worked for 25 plus years now in the South Australian Public Service and now the Commonwealth. So I'm probably not the person who should be stood up here talking about First Nations issues and what we need to do. The people we need to be listening to are people like Kirsten and many others across the sector who have that lived experience. However, if me being up here can help Kirsten and others in the profession push the importance of the work that is being done and undertaken internationally at the moment, then that's a good thing. One of the things that was mentioned in the Welcome to Country by Auntie Jude was the importance of sharing history. And it's only very recently in this country that we've started to have a shared history. For many people who grew up in Australia and went to school in Australia, the history was very much a white history. It was a history of the last 200 or 300 years, not the last 60,000 years. We are fortunate to live and work alongside the oldest living culture in the world today. And we should be recognising that, and we should be holding it up, and we should be using it as a shining light and not trying to hide it away. That notion of sharing history means that we as archivists have a significant role in protecting the material in our care, making sure that it is accessible and not just accessible to white people who live in metropolitan cities. It also means that we have a responsibility around the stories that are being told and being part of making sure that the stories that are told are not told from one particular viewpoint, that of the white colonialist. I'd just like to take a second to, I guess, look back on my career and reflect a bit on where I've come from as a bit of a sort of a prelude to what I want to say today. I was fortunate enough to get my first role working in State Records of South Australia as an archivist back in 1997, so 25 years ago this year. And that was the same year that the Bringing Them Home report was released. Coming into the industry at that time, and it does seem a long time ago now, I didn't fully understand or fully grasp the nature or the importance of that report at that time. But over the years that followed and working with First Nations colleagues, you get to understand the importance of that document and what a watershed moment that was for Australian history and our shared history. It was the first time that there was national recognition of what had occurred to the stolen generation, and that the acts of genocide and the impacts of the acts of genocide had on individuals and on families and on culture. It was also a significant recognition of the importance of the archival record in fighting wrongs of the past and in supporting truth-telling. As I said, that was 25 years ago. Has much changed? We're still here having the same conversations that were being had 25 years ago. A lot of good work has occurred since then, but not enough. And I think we're at a point in our history now as a profession and as an industry that I think we're on the cusp of real change, and I think that's really positive, and that's been led by people like Kirsten and others across the sector. I'd also like to acknowledge the work that Barbara Reid does in a similar vein in relation to the rights of the child and care leavers, and I think both of those pieces of work are really pulling this the profession, the industry, and all of us individually in the right direction. We need a different way of working, and we need to start by acknowledging the biases of the systems that we operate and work within, the systems that we have helped create and preserve over time. I think there are some known truths that benefit from restatement. First and foremost, the appalling treatment of First Nations people and culture in Australia. And uncomfortably, the fact that archives and other collecting institutions are not immune to being part of that. We are colonial constructs. We operate on a westernized system of history, a history where the story that is told is the story of the victor, and the records that we hold in our collection have significant bias, both in terms of what records were collected, how they're curated, the language that's used, the stories that are told, and the voices that are hidden. But the importance of the archival record can't be diminished. It's important from a whole range of things, from redress and reconciliation, allowing truth-telling, reconnection to family, to culture, as I said, to nation and to language. And so we have a responsibility to make sure that we preserve those records and we provide access to them, and that we work closely with our First Nations colleagues and communities to make sure that the stories are told. But in doing so, we do have to accept and understand the inherent bias in the systems that we work within and that we've created. And it's our job as archivists within those systems, within your own organisations, to make the changes. Kirsten and her colleagues can't do it all for us. We have to do that ourselves. And to do that, we have to listen to First Nations people. For too long, our systems and our work has been done by white people, by archivists, for Aboriginal people, not with them. As an industry and a profession, we need to respond to the challenges still facing First Nations people and the challenges that have been laid bare today by Kirsten in her speech, and through the work of many others, including the Henrietta Fourmile's piece back in 1988, 1989. Issues of access, and making sure that that access is equitable and that it's fair and that it supports voice. It's our traditionally, access for the archives has been provided in a metropolitan area, far away from community, far away from land. It's very difficult for First Nations communities to access those records if they to physically get to those places. Having to walk into a government institution when it's the very same government that has caused the harm and the trauma in the first place is very, very difficult and impossible for some people. You're then faced with language that is very government, very bureaucratic, again, very westernised. Without the support materials, in many instances, dealing with people who don't understand your culture, don't understand the trauma that you or your family has been through. All of these issues around access are not faced by white people. They're not faced by, the normal historical researchers that we've seen in the past walking in and being able to access those collections. It's very difficult to understand the construct of an archive, particularly a government archive, with all of the layers of bureaucracy that you need to get through just to get access to the records that might enable you to reconnect to family. There are issues of ownership and authority, which again have been touched on today. I'm going to use one of the buzzwords, which I'm now not going to use anymore, but cultural safety is really important. But I will in future, I'll talk about the social, cultural and emotional well-being. And I think, for me, as Kirsten was talking, I was making copious notes. And I think for all of us, we have to acknowledge that this is a journey where we are constantly learning, but we have to be open to learn and to understand and to change. One of the very important things that we as archivists can do is support the right of reply. We need to acknowledge the histories that we hold are the histories of the westernised government, and that those documents that we hold and preserve don't always tell the truth, and in many instances don't tell the truth. At best, they tell one side of the story. At worst, they contain lies about people and untruths. And so it's important for us as a profession and as an industry, individual institutions, to ensure that we have the ability to provide that right of reply, to allow the voice of the First Nations people to be heard alongside those of the government records or the records created by the religious institution or whatever it might be. The notion of repatriation and providing collections back to First Nations communities, and this isn't an issue just for the archival sector, but for the GLAM sector more broadly. One of the things I would like us to move away from is what I hear quite often is the notion of digital repatriation. To me, that's a really awkward notion, because digital repatriation is essentially just providing a copy. That's not repatriation. And so we need to, again, look very closely. That notion of digital repatriation is, again, something that's come from us as archivists, white archivists, without that consultation with First Nations people. Yes, it's okay to provide a digital copy if that's what they want, but let's not dress it up as repatriation, because that's not repatriation. We need to work very closely with our First Nations colleagues and communities to understand what it is that they want. And there's a lot of work that we need to do. And again, Kirsten touched on it today around the hurt and the trauma and the re-traumatisation that can be felt when accessing records within archival institutions. There's a lot of work being done over recent years around re-traumatisation. The ASA has done work around trauma-informed training. They've got some trauma-informed training. And I think, the importance of being able to understand the impact of the material within our collections and to provide both spaces and the support that's needed, whether it's through the archival institution or through other support networks, to help people access that material, to understand the language that's used in some of that material, which is horribly racist in some instances. And it's not just a case of getting the box off the shelf, getting a file off the box and handing over that record. We need to be more aware of the impact of the material that we hold and more supportive of in providing access to that material. As I mentioned, we do operate quite significantly through service models that have been built up over time based on Western ideals of cultural collection. They're designed by the archives for Aboriginal people, not with them. And the importance of that connection, I think, can't be understated. As we move forward as a profession, the importance of voice is critical. We need to engage, and we need to engage properly, and that means listening, and it also means learning as well. We have a responsibility, all of us as archivists, as keepers of records, no matter what position you're in within your organisation, we have a responsibility to our First Nations communities, and to the history of this country, and to our colleagues to do much better. One of the things that was touched on briefly earlier, and one thing that I'm really passionate about, I think one area that we need to improve vastly is around diversity. I look around this hall here, and there's not a lot of diversity, particularly in relation to the employment of First Nations people in archives. I've had the pleasure of working alongside some wonderful people, Andrew Wilson in State Records of South Australia, Phyllis Williams in National Archives, who have done a significant job over a number of years in improving the work of those organisations with First Nations communities, and at the same time supporting cultural change across their own institutions. I think it's important for us to acknowledge the courage shown every day by First Nations people when they walk into a government archive to do their work. They're faced not only with having to work in an institution and within a bureaucracy that has in the past had a terrible impact on their family and their community. They're also faced with the additional burden of not only having to do their roles, but of becoming the place where, or the person that everybody goes to for anything that relates to First Nations issues. And that in itself is unfair. They also have to face the burdens that are placed onto them by community. And so we need to acknowledge that, and we need to support them better. And it's not just about us employing First Nations people in dedicated roles that have a specific focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service. It's about making sure that we employ people across the length and breadth of the work of our organisations, so that we have people working in our research centres, we have people working in our policy development areas, we have people in our communications and our executive who are First Nations people. And to do that, we need to support people coming into the profession. I've had, a lot of conversations with Nicola about how we can get people to come into the profession. We're a profession that's based on people getting a tertiary education. Lots of First Nations people don't have that opportunity. So we're already making it difficult for people to join the profession. We have to find new ways to support them, whether that's through enabling people to come into the profession as school leavers, and either supporting them through tertiary education or finding pathways that don't involve going to university, but still allowing them to be professional members of the profession and of our institutions. And we've got a long way to go there, but I know that in talking to the ASA recently, they're currently about to employ an education officer, and hopefully one of the focuses of that role will be on how we improve diversity across the sector, and how we can help put in place mechanisms to educate people if they don't come in through that tertiary process. There is progress being made, though, and across a large areas of the sector. I will touch briefly on the Tandanya Declaration because I think it is another one of those important milestones. But I think it's important for us all to know that declaration isn't a magic bullet that's going to solve all of the problems. It's not the be all or an end all. It's just a part of the framework that we need to consider. The declaration pushes all of us to remodel the principles that we work on, and is based around the themes of knowledge authorities, property and ownership, recognition and identity, research and access, and self-determination. At the centre of all of those, though, is the notion of voice, and the voice of First Nations people. As a sector, we can't make changes, and this has been demonstrated over many, many years, where government institutions or religious institutions make changes or put in place services that we think are the right thing to do for First Nations people without having that voice, without listening to them, and without working with them to make sure that those services are the services that they actually need and are delivered in a way that they need them to be delivered. There's significant amount of work going on within the jurisdictions, in Queensland, in Victoria, in South Australia. I was fortunate enough to be Director of State Records of South Australia when we were pushing to establish an Aboriginal reference group. We did that in consultation with and in conjunction with the State Library of South Australia, and it was a really important initiative for us. It was the first of its kind in South Australia, and it really was driven by the notions that came out of the Tandanya Declaration and the need for us to understand and listen to the voice of our First Nations customers. We commenced the establishment of that group based on an initial open voice session where we met with elders of communities within South Australia, within First Nations support networks, and staff from across the archival and GLAM sector. And one of the I guess the key themes of that that session was around the importance of voice, and we could only give voice to First Nations communities through the establishment of a group of that nature. So we worked with the Commissioner for Aboriginal Engagement within South Australia to communicate with communities, to seek interest from people who wanted to be part of that group. And we were very fortunate to be able to establish that group just before I left the role in South Australia. And the group has some fabulous voice. It's well represented with some very senior leaders within the First Nations community. And I know that the State Records of South Australia and the State Library will continue to work very closely with that group as they look to start redesigning their services. At National Archives, we've recently moved over to the arts portfolio, and our minister and the government has a significant focus on the cultural policy. And the first pillar of that policy is around First Nations people and support. And so I think that gives us a good view of what the future is going to look like under this government. National Archives has also done a lot of tremendous work, as I said, under Phyllis's stewardship. We have the Our Way protocols that we developed in response to the Tandanya Declaration, which really drive where we are focused for over the coming years in terms of how we engage and provide services to First Nations people. We have specialised services. We have an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander engagement team, and we have things like the Bringing Them Home Index, which all go to support the work that we're trying to do and the improvements that we're trying to make. And at a national level, CARA has a First Nations special interest group, and we are currently in the process of finalising a plain Tandanya Declaration, which will also be looking at converting into multiple First Nations languages as well. Just very briefly before I finish, looking to the future, we need to recognise as a profession the ongoing impact of colonialisation. But I am of the strong view that archives can be a force for change, and we need to grasp the opportunity we have now in front of us. We need to have services that are driven by and in conjunction with First Nations voice. And we can't let that fear or that feeling of being uncomfortable stop us from making change and from doing the right thing. And so, in closing, I'd just like to challenge myself and all of you to go back to your institutions and to make a difference. Thank you.
They lied, it's not on. Oh, it is, hi. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Kirsten. So I was asked to introduce and moderate today, and I've failed because while I was blowing my nose to begin with, I actually missed one of the most important sentences here, actually introducing you, Kirsten, aside from being a deadly Worimi woman. Dr. Kirsten Thorpe is a senior researcher at the Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology in Sydney. So if you want to chase her up, that's where she is. So sorry for forgetting that to begin with. I'll never get a gig again, so this is the last one. It's almost morning tea time, so I'm just looking at officials to see if we can have a couple of questions, or if you'd like to wrap it up and go to morning tea. It's got a couple of minutes. Is that okay for a quick couple of questions? So hopefully, do I put my teacher voice on? Did you take some notes? You've got some questions. I'm assuming someone's going to run around with a mic, unless that's also my job, which I'm happy to do. Hello, mic over there and a mic over here. There's a hand up in front here and down the front if we mind having a couple of questions. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thank you both, Kirsten and Simon. I'm Fiona Blackburn. I've been thinking lately about the balance between Indigenous protocols and institutional protocols like the ASA protocols and your, sorry, I can't remember the name of the AWA. Yeah. And also the requirement for non-Indigenous archivists to engage in the kind of critiquing and reflexivity and the courageous self-reflection that I think Indigenous people and archivists and scholars have been doing for a long time now. Now, I say balance between each of those things, but I think maybe they're the things that are going to get contested over the next long time or little while. I'd just be interested to hear both or either of you to talk about what you think the balance between those three things are: Indigenous protocols, institutional protocols, and professional reflexivity and self-reflection. Thanks.
Do you want me to go first? Okay. I think we're in a position... is this working? Yes? Okay, cool. So I think we're... just checking. I think we're in a position as an industry where over the next few years we're going to see, I hope to see, a lot of discussion around those protocols and how... And I would hope that over time, and I guess this was my point about the importance of institutions like mine and other sort of government and even non-government institutions working with and collaborating with First Nations communities, that those protocols will actually come together. There shouldn't. I don't think there should be. Moving forward, I don't think there should be a discrepancy. I think, some of the terms that get thrown around and used can be initially can be quite confronting for archivists. So you talk about decolonisation, issues of sovereignty and repatriation are not are quite difficult concepts to grasp and to come to sort of get a handle on. But we can't. Again, it comes back to the point that we have to design our services, and we have to look at how we deliver those and what we do in conjunction with First Nations voice. And so I think over time that the traditional practices that we've seen within the archival profession will sort of come together with the protocols that are that we're talking about today and the things that have come out of Kirsten's research.
Is that working now? Yep. I feel quite worn out after laying bare all those harmful impacts. But yeah, I mean, I would like to see that the profession works in partnership with communities so that we have agreement making. And I think that we're tipping the scale at the other end at the moment, where we're creating these documents that are aspirational, they guide a level of good intent, and I think we've got a lot to be proud of, but we aren't being met in a way that is around negotiation. So I think there are a lot of assumptions in the protocols. I think if we were to work with existing community governance and infrastructure, that conversation and the dialogue in the middle might be different around the protocol. So that's probably the thing that I would think around that. But I actually think even watching, being up here and looking at people's faces when you talk about those harmful impacts, we always jump to, well, how do we fix this? But I really would encourage the profession to just start to do that, to be a part of the dialogue, because I think until you start to go back and look at, it's not just about the collections, and I think people focus so much on the content of the collections. It's about, as I was talking about, what are the things that we're doing that, knowingly or unknowingly, perpetuate that colonial project, and start to think about that, and don't always think, well, where will that go? Because I think the dialogue will make, that's for everyone to listen and learn and share. And the comments about time, and again, just to really acknowledge, I know Simon was saying me, but that research was a lot of people's input into that, and a lot of people shared stories. That notion of time is something that we also need to think about. It's going to take time, and so we need to invest in that in a really meaningful way.
Great, thank you. Another question from the crowd, or if there's people online as well? I think there are people online. No one's on. They're quiet online. We had a question down the front here. Is this person with the glasses in the front there? Thank you.
Thanks. It's very humbling to be living on this land which belongs to the world's oldest continuous culture. I'm wondering how can those stories from tens of thousands of years work their way into an archive, and would they even belong there?
Interesting question.
Yeah, I think for me, looking at the aspirations of, when I went through the doctoral process and seeing Joanne Evans in the room at Monash, there's so much that people were saying, like, Kirsten, it's too big, how do you keep the focus? And I think one of the things that I hope that I've done and can give back to the profession is a higher level view of, this is the space that, and like with the theme, here we are, this is what's happened. Amazing people have done amazing things, but this is where we've landed. And I think part of the doctoral process for me was hearing the uncomfortableness, hearing the things that people were challenged by, particularly the workforce, having to negotiate all these interests. But no matter what, within that, everyone talked about, this is what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are about, the stories, the connection to place. And so for me, that idea of well-being and thinking about, people talk about community archives, but I'd like us to think broader than that this is about actually sustaining country. And so a living archive on country is for everyone to enjoy. It's not just people-centred, it's about nature, it's about caring for the land. So how do we get ourselves shifting into that dialogue? And I think in that way, from my perspective, I think communities want to share those stories. It's just about the trust, and it's about what kind of space we create. The people here from Queensland, the Indigenous Knowledge Centres, there's things happening, there's things that are embedded in those frameworks, but we don't see ourselves in the archives profession as necessarily being a part of that all the time. So yeah, I don't know if I'm hopeful is the right word, but I think there are deep aspirations for another kind of archival landscape, but we just have to start to shift ourselves to resource that as well.
Great. I think I'm getting a red flag being, and this I'm assuming means wrap it up. And I can hear Tummy's grumbling for morning tea time as well, and I'm sure it's time for caffeination. Thanks so much again to Simon and to Kirsten for the keynote and the response this morning. There's some amazing things to take away and to think about, and I encourage you to catch up with them for a yarn if you need to, but also to enjoy the rest of the conference. So thanks very much, everyone.